It's the Cavaliers Basketball Club Podcast.
It's basketball time to kill.
Love picks up Curry.
Kyrie Irving from downtown. Up for the layup. Oh, blocked by James.
It's over. The 52-year drought is over. The Cavaliers have won the NBA championship.
Cleveland, this is for you.
Sexton works on Irving. He knocks it down.
Heat check time.
Allen to Garland, 1 second left for midcourt.
Strongest goal. Oh, what a rejection by Mobley.
And he throws the hammer down.
The shoot-around.
It's the second round of the playoffs, and things have remained interesting. Giannis continues to beast mode his team to victory as the Celtics can only watch him pass the ball to himself for easy dunks. Miami seemed poised to take advantage of an Embiid-less Sixers, but Game 3 certainly became a big wake-up call for their finals ambitions, scoring only 79 points. Oh, and rumors abound have begun throughout the NBA. Fun stuff!
As you mentioned, rumor season has started across the NBA. I really like the rumor that Frank Vogel got fired because he, quote, couldn't make Russell Westbrook productive. Do you have a favorite rumor?
Well, in some ways, I find some schadenfreude continuing with the Lakers situation and the rumor that LeBron's going to be traded. Now, of course, today I read that Davis is going to be traded. They have 2 players they may trade for with Miami. Clearly, it didn't go so well because both rumors we've mentioned are Lakers issues. So,
I love the idea that LeBron could also come back to Cleveland and all his problems would be solved. Just makes me laugh so much. Coming back a third time just to run away from the sinking ship that is the Lakers right now would be hilarious.
yeah, I think last podcast we talked about who is more sad, Durant or LeBron. It's possibly LeBron this week. I don't know.
It could be, especially if he's stuck with Westbrook even longer. Could you imagine Westbrook staying, but they trade Davis?
I'm glad I'm not a Lakers fan.
Never.
According to Evan Dammarell of Right Down Euclid, Detroit Pistons swingman Jerami Grant could be on the Cavs' radar. Do the Cavs need to make this move?
I think the Cavs need to make a move. I don't think they necessarily need to make this move or this type of move. My understanding from what Evan Dammarell was reporting is the Cavs would potentially have to give up Markkanen or LeVert, plus a future first-round pick and maybe 2 future second-round picks. That is a big haul for what I think is essentially a journeyman small forward. He's never been the go-to player for a good team or a playoff caliber team. And though he has great size and physical attributes, being 6'8", and can guard multiple positions, he can guard the power forward and small forward and shooting guard, which is something we would covet because we don't really have a wing. I just think that's a really big price to pay for a guy who, as I mentioned, isn't a high level player. He is a good player. He is a player that can be added to a team that's probably further along in the process than the Cavs and can really contribute, but he's not a player that I would give up possibly 2 role players or multiple draft picks for in any capacity. He's also 28 years old, which would make him the oldest starter by far on the team, because if you're making this type of trade, he is a starter. You wouldn't trade that many assets for a backup. At 28, I would assume he only has 3, maybe 4 solid years left, and he might have already hit his peak. Because they say that NBA players really, when they're 26, 27, that's when they figure everything out. Well, at 26, those were his best numbers, and he regressed last year. So it's like, he might have already crescendoed, and we would be stuck with a guy who's declining in productivity versus maybe excelling. So I would be very hesitant in making a move like this. Do you think I'm on the right path, or do you think they need to pull a trigger on a move like this?
Well, I think our podcast, if it requires controversy for us to be popular or to be recognized, we're not going to manage it with this question because we're on the same page for sure. I don't think the Cavaliers need to make a move like this at all. I think we already have a player on the roster that is similar in stat production. His name is Lauri Markkanen. We've signed him to a 4-year, $80 million deal, and he's got 3 years left of that contract. I thought when we signed him, we got a pretty good value for that because he seemed to be advertising more, that he could be much more of a main player, a offensive, consistent kind of player with the Chicago Bulls, and it didn't go the way that they had expected, and so they kind of dumped him. I think he took the opportunity to get signed with a team and lock in on some cash, and we favored in that moment in a lot of ways. We were able to bring in a guy that I think people didn't expect could play small forward as much as he did. He's proven that, at least on this team, in the way that we're going to use him in our offensive sets. So we have a two-way small forward, power forward player now that averages about 14.8 points per game. His rebounds are actually 1.6 greater, at least last season it was, to Grant's stats. He's only 24 years old. He averages more games per season. He doesn't get as injured. And he shoots better, basically from the field, a few percentage points. They average about the same from three. The big difference to me are a couple of lines I discovered when researching him this season. And one was from NBC Sports from Dan Feldman back in January when he was being tossed around as a trade piece before the deadline. Plenty of teams valued Grant as the defensive first role player he was in Denver. But if he insists on remaining a high-usage offensive player, that would limit trade options. And apparently it did. Then he also has to say, in many ways, Grant has impressed as a Pistons go-to scorer. Grant's shooting efficiency is mediocre, and his passing lags even further behind for someone with the ball in his hands so much. So that's not great. It's one man's opinion, but I don't like any of that. That's for sure. We don't need somebody like that added to our team because shooting efficiency is already an issue with Markkanen. However, Markkanen is not looking to be a main offensive scorer on the team. He's not demanding that. And from that angle, I also read this from Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report. He stated, sources say Grant expects to sign a lucrative extension in the ballpark of 4 years, $112 million this offseason. For any team to sign off on a trade for Grant, they'll need assurances of his plans to re-sign this offseason, just like Aaron Gordon did in Denver. Grant also has a little interest in joining a new situation where he doesn't feature as a primary offensive option. Sources also say Detroit is now asking for 2 first-round picks and 1 first-round pick, plus a high-upside young player. So all of that makes me say, nah, we don't need a guy added to our team that is demanding to be a primary offensive option. When he shoots subpar, he's going to demand more of the ball in order to get his offensive production. We have enough players on our team that I'm not sure we're going to find shots for those guys. We don't need a ball hog coming in thinking that now he's going to be a main guy on the team, ruining the team chemistry that we've been building over the last couple of seasons. So Lauri understands his role on this team, won't look to be a main offensive contributor night in and night out. You've got him in your system for a year. He should come back even more comfortable next year. And again, he's under contract for 3 more years for less money and basically the same stats. So no, not this guy. No. Is there a player that you can think of that we need that is available that we should go for? Because if not him, who?
The guy that I've heard the most through the grapevine in the sense of what some Cavs media members have talked about, Chris Fedor has brought it up in, I believe, in a couple of his articles and on his pod, is Bojan Bogdanovich from Utah. The reason why people are interested in him is he's a small forward who can shoot really well. He's a 7-year player. His three-point percentage through his career has never dropped below 35%. The last few years, it's basically hovered around 40%, and at times has even been closer to 43%. That's just from the three-point arc. He is known as a really solid shooter, and the Cavs need that type of production. And he would also fit the mindset of getting another quote-unquote wing. He's not as athletically inclined as Grant, but he's a guy that fits roles where I don't think Bogdanovich would be asking for the ball every night or wanting to be the primary hub offensively for the Cavs. So I think they need to find a small forward or a wing if they want to in free agency that fits more of a role like what you're laying out in your argument, or what you laid out in your argument with Markkanen versus a Grant, because Grant's attitude seems to be that he thinks he's a primary or number one player in the NBA, and he just has never been that. The Pistons weren't a good team the year he was a primary scorer, and the Pistons, if they thought that Grant was going to be this amazing number one scorer all the time, they wouldn't have drafted Cunningham number one. They went and got a point forward, essentially, in Cunningham, who was going to be their number one scorer the rest of his career there. That's what they did. So he was replaced in 1 year. That's how much they thought of him. So, yeah, I would gravitate more toward a wing who can fit specific roles if they can't find anybody else. The other thing that's intriguing about Bogdanovich is something is going on with Utah. I think that there could be some solid players that would be available from the Jazz, even if it's not Bogdanovich, because I think they're possibly going to go through a whole rebuild mode, mainly because Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert aren't gelling on the team, and I think that could negatively impact the rest of the players on the team. So there could be some solid players from the Jazz that the Cavs could get in a trade.
This is a team that really now needs to decide how they're going to develop the players that they have. The big issue that we used to complain about as Cavs fans is that we never were very good at the draft. And we couldn't develop players either way, but we could hardly ever pick anybody decent from the draft. And we've done a great job over the last few years with draft and trades. This team is ready to take the next step with what they have. And there's a few players on the bench that are not coming back next year, like Rondo, for example. We do anticipate that Rubio will return. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Obviously, the biggest return is going to be Colin Sexton, and whether or not we can get him signed to a deal. So for me, my mind is more about keeping us whole and adding just a few key players on the bench once we get Sexton back under contract. And then from there, we'll talk about it in question 2. I just value what we have. It's one of the first seasons going into next year that I'm not really looking around the league at much else. I think we have the pieces now. And aside from the few journeymen on the bench that we need to round out the roster, we're sitting pretty as long as we can stay healthy going into next season.
In the same vein, who are your untouchable players on the team?
Well, as I said in question 1 there at the end, very happy with the players that we have, content with the future of this organization, with the young talent that we've assembled. I think the Cavs that are, to me, the most untouchable, and I think the organization still would like to see them out there in the starting 5, the starting unit, would be Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland, Colin Sexton, and Lauri Markkanen. I don't want to see any of those guys go. I'm not necessarily thinking that they're going to be out on the court together in the starting lineup every night. We've had a lot of conversation about Sexton being more of a sixth man next season, depending on how they utilize his skills. There's a lot of question marks coming into next year, and you're going to have that when there's so much inconsistency because of the injuries. So overall, I still want to see what they envision coming into this season and what Bickerstaff had fought for when he went to Altman and said, hey, I want you to go after Markkanen because I believe he could be our starting small forward. There was a plan there to fortify the young, small backcourt with a tall, NBA-ready front court. And ultimately, and this is something I should have said in question one, another reason why I don't care if we pick up a power forward, small forward type position player, Evan Mobley is that, and he is just the future of this team in so many ways. And I think that if he develops the way that we expect him to over the next several seasons, he'll be that guy that the offense is running through so consistently, and you need him to have the touches that you don't want to give to a guy like Grant, right? So another reason why, to go back to one. But then just to round out my untouchables, also runner-ups, glue guys that I think are important as well that I don't want to see go. And no offense to anybody that doesn't make my list here, because I love everybody on the team, but it's Isaac Okoro and Lamar Stevens. Okoro, I still have high hopes for. I'd still like us to believe in his future in the NBA and that it should be in a Cavs uniform. And Lamar Stevens is just that type of player that nothing was given to him, right? That whole line of LeBron, of Cleveland, of nothing's given, everything's earned. You know, I thought it was a little bit of a blowhard line, but Lamar Stevens embodies that. He's the kind of player that you want on your team because his tenacity and his enthusiasm and his energy, his will to be there is just infectious. So those are my guys. How about you?
I think the three for sure that are untouchable are Allen, Mobley, and Garland. I think your point about Mobley becoming more of an offensive hub and needing touches makes perfect sense. I think there are some questions about this roster, but it's really only because of injury. Maybe caliber of player, but not really. I think their weakest position of glaring need right now is backup point guard. Sexton is very good, but they've asked him to be a shooting guard in some capacity. So I kind of look at the fact that we missed Rubio so much when he got injured last year. They're going to need to bring in somebody who can spell Garland and also be able to play with Sexton and everybody else in a way that is unselfish and command that side of the ball, command the offense and that second unit in a way that is helpful for the team, because Garland was just, he was playing 40 minutes a night at the end of the season. So they really need that. Could they use a wing? That's the eternal question for every NBA team. They can always use more wings, right? But I don't think that they necessarily need to chase down and give up a bunch of our current players just for one wing who could do something occasionally productive. And they also have their number one pick this year. And I haven't really sat down and looked at all of the entire draft and where everybody's laying out, but I do know that there are a lot of good players who would fit the mold of a wing. There are quite a few players who have 6'5" to 6'9" height with, close to 7-foot wingspan. I would love a player like that because that allows the versatility on defense to actually guard multiple positions, which will be helpful, especially if you're going to have a small backcourt in Sexton and in Garland. Bringing in a guy who could spell them for a little bit and be able to guard the 2, 3, and 4 is always helpful. I feel like I'm hedging a little bit on this, but I would say that all of your players that you named of Mobley, Allen, Garland, Sexton, Markkanen, Okoro, and Stevens, those are all players I would like to see on the team next year. I think Dean Wade is another guy I would like to see again, mainly because of Love's injury history and Love's ability to get injured often. That is a trait of his career now. So I think that Wade is a good insurance policy for whether or not Love gets hurt. And I would also say that if the team needed to make a move and there were players that I could kind of understand or swallow them not being on the team next year, it would probably be players more like Jetty, or I could even be okay with LeVert, depending on the deal, if he got traded. I would say Kevin Love is the one guy I could see get moved because this is a business and the Cavs understand that Love's value is currently the greatest it has been since he signed his new contract. And that is crass, but it's still an organization that's looking to improve their youth, and Love is their oldest player. The fact that he was almost sixth man of the year, I could see him going to a team to fill out a Western Conference playoff contender, and we could get maybe a couple picks or another solid veteran back.
The final seconds.
Are you comfortable giving Garland a max contract?
I don't see how you don't make him a max player after this past season. The Cavs will have the cap space, especially with Love's contract winding down. You mentioned this off quote-unquote camera, but we are still paying J.R. Smith. So hopefully we won't be paying other former players anytime soon. I would say that Darius Garland deserves a max contract and will live up to that contract unless somehow injury comes to play, because Darius really loves the organization. He loves the guys that he plays with. He's also improving on a level that's getting a lot of notice. Steph Curry has praised his style of play. We know that Chris Paul has praised his style of play. So I think Garland is an ascending young talent that runs your offense and can be a face for this franchise for years to come.
Looking at the salaries and who's locked in for the next several seasons, Garland is signed through the 23-24 season, and I don't think that we need to make this determination just yet. I think this season proved that he deserves the conversation to be started, which is great, because the previous seasons we weren't sure yet. He took that big leap forward this year, but he did it without Sexton, and that could either be a positive or a negative. We don't know yet. The vision of this team was supposed to be Sexland, right? Both of them combined, it was going to be a powerhouse, dynamic duo kind of thing. Almost two Steph Currys on the team, right? That kind of an idea. And they'd play off of each other, and it would be a high dynamic offense type of team. Well, we don't know yet if that's possible. And if it fails, there are like 3 or 4 possibilities that could come. So it would be Sexton comes back and proves that he's everything that he was before and more, and Garland falls off, and then what do? They could both basically challenge each other and, have a great season combined together and become the duo that we wanted, and then I think both of them make crazy money, and that's the end of the day. If Sexton comes back and can't perform at the level that he was before and struggles with this team, then Garland definitely makes his money. And they sign him even before the trade deadline, and Sexton is moved most likely. So there's a lot of different scenarios here. It's not that I think he is undeserving. It's just the timing is not right yet.
What do you think of the news of JB joining ESPN as a studio analyst for the remainder of the playoffs?
Makes me want to get ESPN. I'm not going to, but it kind of makes me want to watch it again. I'm sure I'll tune into YouTube a little more often to see what he has to say. I'm wondering what his thought process is of why it's a benefit for him to be around that environment. It's not like he's going and sitting on the bench with another team, but you don't get to do that. So I guess this is the closest thing where he can go and analyze the games and see the playoff atmosphere and maybe take a few things away from that experience that he can bring back and share with the team, with that expectation that it is playoffs or bust next year. It has to be. So intriguing. I didn't expect this at all. Kind of came out of left field. What do you think?
I think it's a lot of fun. I think it allows the rest of the NBA media to see who JB is. I think we've always enjoyed his post-game conferences and kind of how he speaks with the media. He's always able to explain his thought process really well after games. That's not always been the case with quite a few coaches of the Cavs. And I think that JB deserves that type of notoriety. He knows how to show the rest of the league what the Cavs are all about. And maybe it'll help him get more Coach of the Year nominations next year as well. The only note I would say is I hope his voice does not go as hoarse as it does after games.
Are you surprised Dean Wade has already recovered from his injury and returned to on-court activities?
I was very surprised because the other guy that had a meniscus tear, Colin Sexton, was out for the season. That tells you I've never had a meniscus tear, and clearly there are different levels or grades to the tear itself. But I'm also happy to see it. We mentioned earlier in the pod, Dean Wade is a guy who has done everything this team has asked him to do. And if he comes back recovered, healthy, and able to contribute again next season, maybe even take a little bit of a jump like Lamar did this season, that would be so beneficial for the franchise as a whole. He shoots well, he plays defense well, he rebounds well. Dean Wade is the type of player that I think you and I will always be fond of.
Going back to what you had mentioned about Kevin Love earlier and kind of how it might be time to trade him because of the value that he has been able to regain. Dean Wade, to me, is what we get out of Kevin Love now. It's just Kevin is unfortunately kind of that novelty, that player that we all love because he's from the championship era and he's been a Cavalier now longer than most have in the time that we've been fans anyway. But he's been overpaid for and his skills have dwindled over the years, especially with the injury issues that he's had. And I really commend the season that he just had. He almost won sixth man. And by that, I mean, he made runner-up, and that's not nothing, right? Especially at his age. It was really unknown what role he would be able to serve for the Cavs coming in this season. So I've got a lot of love for him, a lot of respect. But at the same time, my eyes tell me that what we get from him night in and night out, we could get from Dean Wade if he got his minutes. I'm not trying to disrespect him. If Kevin was still in his prime, I'd want Kevin Love all day long. But if Kevin Love is in the twilight of his career, I think he can do more for another team. And I think that Dean Wade is the player that should step in and take his threes and his minutes moving forward when he's gone. So Dean is a player that's very important to me. And even though he didn't make my players we can't move, he was close. So I'm happy to hear that he's healthy and back out on the court. And that bodes good for him next season. And hopefully he won't have any lingering issues with it moving forward.
Who is the most likely player to not be on the team next year?
Yeah, minus any player that isn't currently signed for next season. I would say Karis LeVert is possibly, I think he's a better trading piece right now than he is likely to make the roster for next season. But it really depends on Sexton signing and a few other things. So for now, I would say Karis, no offense to him, but he's a piece that was added late, didn't really gel the way that they expected. And he's got one season left on his contract for $18 million next year, which that's movable. So my money would be on LeVert. How about you?
Well, my money is also on LeVert, but the other guy that I would mention, just because we've mentioned him in the past, I think Jetty is going to get moved just because of how he played at the end of the season. He clearly does not have the greatest rapport with JB. And if your coach cannot trust you on a regular basis, especially when you're getting to the end of the season to close out games, I would say that your time with the team is probably dwindling.
Thank you for listening to the Cavaliers Basketball Club podcast. Let's go Cavs!